Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Let me start with a warm welcome on behalf of Value for Women to our very first Inclusive Action Hub webinar. My name is Katie Alesbury. I am the Senior Strategic Initiatives Leader at Value for Women, and I'm delighted to be sharing the floor today with a spectacular panel of experts. We're joined by Julia Mensink, Director and Head of Impact at Acumen, and Kate Perkins, Interim Head of Gender and Diversity Finance at British International Investment, or BII, as it's known through its acronym. Let me start by sharing a little bit more about our incredible panel. So Julia Mensink oversees impact strategy, measurement and management at Acumen. She has over 15 years of experience in impact investing, international development and academia, focusing on social impact and economic development. She has led gender initiatives across Acumen and worked with multiple gender experts to support SMEs. And she's also a guest faculty member on the Oxford Impact Measurement Programme at Said Business School. And Kate Perkins is the interim head of the Gender and Diversity Finance team at BII, the UK Development Finance Institution, responsible for driving gender and diversity lens investing and impact across BII. Previously, she was an investment director in the financial services team at BII and sits on the boards of 2 microfinance institutions. Kate has almost 20 years experience spanning impact investing, international development and financial services. So we're delighted to have you join us for what I hope will be a rich and timely discussion on why gender inclusion matters, what's working, and how investors and allies can support SMEs in driving better outcomes for women as employees, leaders, entrepreneurs, and customers globally. A few housekeeping notes. So this webinar will run for 45 minutes, with around 30 minutes in conversation with Kate and Julia, and then 15 minutes for your questions. But we welcome all and any questions and invite you to submit using the Q&A function. So if you're not familiar, you'll see on the bottom bar, you'll see the chat, but there's also a Q&A. So please use the Q&A space to add your questions, and feel free to do this at any time, although we will address questions at the back end of the session during the Q&A. And we'd love to invite you to state your organization when you're posting your question. In terms of the chat, please feel free to use this as well. We'd love to hear from you, and we have a couple of folks behind the scenes supporting the chat and sharing some key information, especially about the Inclusive Action Awards, which I'll share more on shortly. But maybe we could get started by if you could share in the chat where you're joining us from and your organization, and what you're looking forward to about today's discussion. We'd love to have a flavour of who's in the room and what you're keen to hear about today. And I mean, without further ado, I'll share a few words of introduction on why are we here, right? I guess the top line is that despite progress, we're still very far from achieving gender equality. And I think there's an estimated 360 billion a year still needed to meet the Sustainable Development Goal on gender equality. But at the current rate of progress, it would take us over 130 years to close the gender gap. And there's an increasing body of evidence that's showing that gender inclusion and gender equality is not only a moral imperative, it's also an economic game changer. And when women participate fully as entrepreneurs, leaders, employees, and customers, it's really a win for everyone. So businesses see stronger performance, economies grow, and societies, of course, become more equitable. There's also growing momentum behind the private sector as a catalyst for gender inclusion. So we see growing trends like gender lens investing, which are certainly encouraging. But yet still, there's a long way to go. And in particular for today, we want to focus on the huge untapped potential of catalyzing small and medium enterprises, so SMEs in emerging markets, as agents of gender inclusion. SMEs are often the backbone, especially in emerging market economies, and globally make up 90% of businesses and 70% of all jobs. And then high growth and impact-driven SMEs are often the big employers and the economic game changers of tomorrow. So embedding gender inclusion in their DNA can also set us up for success and unlock both business resilience and success for gender inclusion going forwards. And that is why at Value for Women, we launched our first ecosystem building initiative, the Inclusive Action Hub, to inspire and equip SMEs to accelerate gender inclusion. So this initiative is with support of Visa Foundation, and we have launched the Inclusive Action Awards, which recognize and reward SMEs in emerging markets that are championing gender inclusion, with a $5,000 cash prize and global recognition to SMEs who are leading the way. So I'll invite my team to share a little bit more in the chat on how you can apply to the Inclusive Action Awards. And we really encourage you to take the advantage of this opportunity, and please do spread the word within your networks. And if you are joining us from an organization that works with enterprises, we'd love to hear from you on opportunities to partner and jointly amplify and scale our work on gender inclusion. So please do feel free to reach out from that angle as well. So without further ado, I'd love to dive into our panel discussion. And of course, more timely than ever, given that in certain political climates currently, we're seeing an increasing threat towards gender inclusion, but we're also building on decades of research proving how it unlocks business growth and economic prosperity as well as impact. So we want to discuss why gender inclusion matters for investors and SMEs and how we can go further together. So with that said, I'd love to invite Kate. We'd love to hear from you. So BII has long been a champion of gender inclusion in investing. Why should investors care about gender inclusion?
Thanks so much, Katie, and thanks for having me on the panel today. So maybe I'll give a bit of background on BII for those of you who don't know us as an institution, and then lead on to kind of our strategy within the gender space. So BII is formerly CDC, so we are the UK Development Finance Institution. I think we're actually the oldest one in the world, so we were set up back in 1948. And we invest patient, flexible capital across a range of products to support private sector growth and innovation across Africa and Asia. So roughly around kind of 1,500 businesses and assets of kind of $10 billion to give a kind of rough estimate of size. And as a DFI, as you'd expect, inclusive economic development is one of our core strategic objectives. And so promoting gender balance and diversity is a critical part of this. So we actually launched our gender finance strategy back in 2018. And within that, we've kind of focused on two areas. So firstly, advancing gender equality within our own investments. So that's intentionally investing in businesses that are already gender smart. So that might be by creating quality jobs for women or increasing access to products and services for women. And these tend to be the 2x qualified investments, which I can explain a bit more later, but there's been about 2 billion of those investments to date within our portfolio. Or we work with investees to create targets and what we call gender action plans to integrate more gender equality into their business practices. And then secondly, we also champion the growth of gender lens investing and trying to bring the industry along with us. You know, we can't do this alone. So we work with partners like 2x Global, other DFIs, and the Boardroom Africa. And as Katie's already mentioned, you know, we're aware that worldwide, and particularly in the markets that we work in, gender inequality remains kind of deeply ingrained in systems and institutions. So I read some stats, it's 70% of women-owned SMEs lack access to finance. Access to formal financial services is less than 50% in most of our markets, and even lower in some like Pakistan, Egypt, which are below 20%. And a low percentage of management roles as well are held by women. I think that's below 30% as well. So, you know, there's obviously the impact case there, but as we tell our investees, it's not only the right thing to do, but it's also good business sense. And Katie already touched on it, but evidence has shown that gender smart investment strategies can help grow a company's competitiveness. It solidifies its supply base, can improve its human capital, and unlock opportunities for increased profit, growth, and innovation. 40% of entrepreneurs around the world are women, and we control $15 trillion of global consumer spending. So if businesses aren't including women, they're basically leaving money on the table. And there's been some really interesting reports that IFC has done around this, showing that funds with a gender balanced investment teams generate higher returns, I think 10 to 20%, compared to funds that lack diversity. And their portfolio companies as well also outperform their less diverse peers by up to 25%. So the stats are out there. We can show that it's a strong business case for investing in women. We published a report last year actually showing some case studies around this, and we've got some on our website. So I can share links as well in the chat if people are interested further in some of the examples that we've got from BII.
Thank you so much, Kate. And yeah, leaving money on the table is absolutely right. And I was interested that you mentioned the challenging markets and sectors as well. I think I'd love to dive into a little bit of that in a moment. But first, let me turn to you, Julia. So we know that gender inclusion is also critical to Acumen's investment strategy. So I would love to hear from you. Why does gender inclusion matter to you as an investor?
Thanks, Katie, and thanks to Value for Women for hosting this, and thanks to all of you for joining. My name is Julia Mensink. I'm Director of Impact at Acumen. We are an impact investor working across 6 regions, and to date we've impacted 648 million people globally, and we're excited to impact more people and build better markets via our investment strategies. Before I answer why it matters to Acumen, I'd like to start with why it matters to me. I walk my kids to school in the morning. Aiden is 8 and Ella is 6. And it's quite fascinating to see how their minds are absorbing and asking questions. And then they're also really intrigued by what I do as a job, because I talk about the office or I'm on my laptop working. And it's actually great to see how they're starting to understand a sense of economics and even understand something that's quite complicated as investing and doing business, etc. But then it's really hard to answer questions why Ella might only access a few percentage points of the capital that might go to her brother, but not to her if she chooses to become an entrepreneur. It's hard to explain that she might not easily access roles at senior leadership or management teams. It's also hard to recognize, even if she is to pursue a career as an employee, that 61% of women work and adding value not only for their own individual, but also for the wider economies that they operate in. And even especially so, considering as female consumers, as household decision makers, spend over 70% of households' budgets. And yet they're not considered equally in the way that they can. So why that matters to us as an investor, or to me personally, is also because we recognize there's a system change and we all have a role to play. And in particular, in our role as an investor, Acumen is focused on solving the problems of poverty. And we recognize that poverty is not gender neutral. So it is it's core to us as an investor, but it's also core to us for our mission. So we solve the problems of poverty, and we aim to build a world based on dignity, which is the opposite of poverty. So to allow for every decision that we make, the companies that we scale, the communities we cultivate, is designed to serve people living in poverty and build the better markets and economies around them. And so what this looks like in practice is that we are aware that our decisions as an investor, as well as the portfolio that we build and the companies that we support, can benefit from having better inclusion. So more equitable companies are more profitable, sustainable, and impactful. So it's basically a no-brainer. But what we've learned in this work is that there's still power dynamics at play, and there's also usually a lack of clarity on what can be done. So that's why I'm excited about today's conversation. So as Kate already highlighted, the business case is well researched, yet all this potential remained untapped. So if you flip that to a positive, how can we celebrate action that works towards that? And that, I think, is really cool that the Inclusive Action Hub is doing. And for me, the punchline is really, it's doable. Investors and businesses can and should focus on gender inclusion as a smart and right thing to do. But if you emphasize the do, what can be done is really key, at least in how I've been working in this space in the last 10 years. And for us, it shows up that gender inclusion is critical for Acumen as a whole. So we think about, how do you amplify that capability across an organization? That looks pragmatically as things such as the right gender policies, the right training, the right awareness, the right to how it shows up in each of our touch points and sphere of influences. so that is for Acumen as a whole, and it also shows up in each of our investment strategies where we see gender as a dedicated impact component and pathways for us to pay attention to and to drive. This cannot just be a checkbox. So usually we start with data, and as head of impact, I love data, but data itself is not the thing. I disagree with starting with sex disaggregated data and then that's it. You need to use the data for action and then use the data again to drive action. It's really exciting to see that dynamic if you pursue it as such. And as I mentioned, I think this also we've also learned how to be honest about power dynamics. Gender itself is a power dynamic. Investor, company, and business, there is a power dynamic at play. So if we can recognize that, you can be respectful in the way that you position and act within that. And the last thing I'll say is that it's been exciting in our work in the last 5 years to see, and we've evidenced this in a joint report that we did with Value for Women, the Pathways to Growth, that we've seen evidence that the companies, the SMEs that actively integrate gender strategies, they outperform their peers. And we as investors have a role in that because we can facilitate the clarity and also offer the TA, or in fact the capital and the cash, to take certain actions that otherwise might be difficult to do just as business as usual or other priorities take hold. So we really are excited about this, but we also see some of the barriers, and therefore I think a positive approach to celebrate the way can be very, very exciting and motivating.
Thank you so much, Julia. And in the spirit of understanding what can be done, I'd love to follow up and ask if you can share any real world results that you've seen from companies that have embraced inclusion. And yeah, if there are any examples or insights from your portfolio that you could share.
Would you like me to go back on this one? Yes, absolutely. So we've worked with gender specialists at Value for Women and beyond to identify what is it that can help for a company. And in the last 5 years, we had a dedicated effort across both our African portfolios, East and Western Africa. And what we saw is that low cost, high impact strategies that can work. They demonstrate both the business and the social and or the gender wins. And for that, we've seen successful, our top strategies really start with recognizing where are you now? We meet the world where it is. We don't start with the judgment, or you must be there, or gender is this big thing. No, we want to see, okay, how does gender show up in your current business operations? And that can help the companies to understand, and we've seen results of the SMEs that have been able to differentiate themselves in the market, but also fundraise better and gain investor confidence by the clarity by which they can speak to this work. And specifically, we learned that there are 6 top strategies that companies can act on, and we've got examples and evidence across the report. And I'll just go through each one quickly to give you a sense of what that looks like and what could be a relevant starting point for you if you're an SME. So the first 2 pathways are really about how you engage women across your value chain and your business model. The first one is about increasing benefits to women customers. And this is growing your market share for the business. And here we focus intentionally on reaching more women, but also thinking about what can be improved in terms of your products and services to be impactful and useful. And that can entail improving the value proposition, the marketing messages, and delivery channels to reach more women. So there's something here, it connects to the last of the 2 X pillars, like how do you incorporate customers? Does the product or service have an elevated or an outsized effect on women and girls? But also just recognizing, are you reaching enough women across your current customer base? The second pathway focuses on supply chains. And in our case, that is thinking about the actions that connect women to, in particular, formal agriculture supply chains, which then can result in increased volume for companies. So this is where we, as Acumen, operate a lot with smallholder ag businesses. So then working with and reaching out female farmers is key to actually the volume and the quality. And I can share an example of that in a second. The other pathways are really what you can do within your own context, so internally on your own workforce. And this is where we've seen, which actually for some business also include commission-based sales agents or digital marketeers, etc. So these pathways help to attract and retain the talent, which in particular in emerging markets is a real challenge. So if you consider gender inclusion, they can include a mindfulness during recruitment, or how to get more women into quality jobs, not just more women, but also how can you get the elevated roles and the seniority improved. The other one is helping sales agents to increase their sales. So how can you empower women? And in some cases that might include offering motorbike training or digital training or tech training. So how can you amplify the role of women across your sales agent network? And the last two focus on fostering a work culture in which women can thrive, so that the voices and the perspectives are included. And finally, ensuring safety in the workplace is key. And one example to just make this come to life is Work, which is an agriculture business in West Africa who's been very proactive in gender for quite a few years. They aggregate staple grain crops from smallholders and also offer agricultural inputs and services. And what they recognize is that their volume wasn't sufficient. They didn't get enough produce. And what they saw is that women were not able to reach them. And they would often have smaller portions of the produce to sell. So they used to work with a lead agent, usually male farmer, to go out and get the crops. But now they pivoted and they made a dedicated effort to create hubs. And they dedicated this hub to be powered by women. They call them WOW, Women of Work. They employed women to host the hubs, which were more locally placed. And by doing that, the women farmers could access more, but also the women could manage this. And it had ambitious growth plans. And what's really exciting is to share some of the results that within 2 years, work increased 14-fold the total supply. They had the number of hubs was scaled to 77, which employ a total of 150 female managers who are now in an elevated role. And 61 of the women farmers and 40% of the men farmers reported that their life very much improved, which is the highest rate of a phone conversation that we have with them via an impact measurement company. And 96 of the farmers and hub managers increased earnings after working with Work. So here you see an amazing example of both social and business wins.
Such a powerful example. Thank you, Julia. I wish we had the little emoji reactions enabled, because I'd be like celebrating on hearing those amazing wins. And honestly, it's so fantastic to hear about the pathways. I think one of the things that we often hear in our work at Value for Women is like, oh, yes, we're definitely on board with gender inclusion, but it's not for me, it's not for my sector, or it's not for my stage of business. And I think that what the examples that you've shared point to is that there are, it is for everyone, and that there are those entry points and pathways, no matter where you are in your size, sector, geography, and your point about like understanding first where you're at in order to set the base for going forwards is super critical as well. But let me turn to you, Kate. Are there any real world examples that you might like to share from your experience?
Yeah, sorry to clear my throat. Yeah, no, I can give a couple. I've actually just pasted in the chat as well, so hopefully people can see a link to our report that I mentioned we published last year, which is lessons from 6 years of investing in women. So that's got some great examples across our portfolio of where inclusion has been integrated at either a fund or business level. And as I mentioned, sometimes those are investees that are already doing it from the point of investment, which is great to see, and we just want to accelerate that and help those companies grow. Others we've worked on, as I said, action plans. We provide technical assistance to kind of get them up to a certain level. And so 2 examples I wanted to share. I mean, I thought first it was really interesting to hear from Julia around the value proposition and the different pathways. I think we see very similar things in our portfolio. But I wanted to focus on 2 examples, one from Africa, one from Asia, which show this kind of value proposition at an employee and at a customer level. Firstly, we provided a loan to Sun King. Some of you might have heard of. It's a global leader and manufacturer of pay-as-you-go off-grid solar energy products in Africa. And so women already represented the majority of customers and employees when we invested, which was great, especially in the energy sector. But there was this disparity in progression of women to mid-management roles. And so we worked with Norfund, one of the other DFIs, to create Equal Voices. We co-funded it under technical assistance to support and empower women in mid-manager sales positions via peer learning circles, and also develop e-training modules and mentorship for junior female sales agents. And what we saw was there was a demonstrated increase in women's sense of confidence and community with colleagues. There was a lot more knowledge sharing, and then as well as developing these kind of foundational technical skills to get them up to the next level. And so through this pilot, we're really now seeing that being able to scale going forward and get more women into these senior leadership positions. And then secondly, an example from India, which again demonstrates both the impact, but also the commercial sense of investing in women. So Veritas is a non-financial banking company. So it's lending to over 170,000 MSMEs in India. And I'm sure as people on the call are aware that many Indian MSMEs find it difficult to get loans from banks, and this is particularly acute for women. I think only about 7% in India women MSMEs are able to access financing from formal financial services. And we worked on a gender action plan with Veritas to determine the size of the women entrepreneur market. We trained loan officers to better understand the needs of women customers, and then we promoted workforce diversity and policies. And that ended up them launching a loan product for women. And in that first year of launching the loan product, new women borrowers grew by 60%. So that meant in real terms that over 10,000 women were getting access to finance for their SME businesses for the first time. And from a commercial perspective, it's also great for the institution itself because they're growing their customer base. So really saw that as a really successful example of where that intervention helped from both an impact and commercial perspective.
Super interesting and inspiring examples. Kate, I'd love to follow up with you actually. It's interesting to see, well, especially the example that you mentioned on Sun King. Obviously, you mentioned that they were already quite far on their gender inclusion journey. I'd love to understand, yeah, from your perspective, like what do you look for when assessing a prospective investee on gender inclusion? Do they already have to be that advanced, or does it differ a little bit depending on the stage that they're at or the sector? Like maybe if there's a traditionally male-dominated sector, how does that look like and how does that vary?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. Generally at BII, so maybe taking a step back, so we were actually a co-founder and we played quite a leading role in the 2X challenge. So, again, some of you might have heard of that. This was launched back in 2018 at the G7 summit, and it's really become I'd say a pivotal initiative dedicated to promoting investments that contribute to gender equality. And it's really become an industry standard since then in gender lens investing. So today, I think it's mobilized over $33 billion in investments and has over 150 members worldwide. And so under BII strategy, the way that we assess our investments, and we've mainstreamed this into our investment process, is to assess them against the 2X criteria. And we've actually committed to a target for 25% of all new investments every year to qualify under this 2X challenge. And we've seen this translate as a signal into the market that gender is a really key investment priority for us. There's 6 criteria, and again, I can post a link in the chat. There's a website which goes into detail on all of this and also a reference guide by 2X. But it covers several different things. So entrepreneurship and ownership, leadership, employment, the supply chain, products and services, and portfolio as well, so particularly for financial institutions. And there's also some criteria there around ESG and governance. So for example, safeguarding is also a key thing that we look at as part of our assessments. But we're not only looking for a tick box exercise. So there's some thresholds in there that we companies have to meet. For example, it might be 30% of women in employment, but that isn't enough. Like it needs to be more than that. And so it needs to be around also being intentional as well. So you can't, I think Katie, you said it in a panel recently, you can't just add women and stir. Companies need to have kind of high quality jobs for women. They need to be thinking through gender smart practices in recruitment or retention, implementing supportive workplace policies, professional development programs, etc. And so one really good example I've seen of that, and to your point, it's about that benchmarking as well in specific cultures or sectors. So we invest in HBL Bank in Pakistan. And when we invested, it was 11%, I think, female employment. And we've worked with that company, that institution, to get them up to 22% today, so doubling where they were before. And that's very high compared to the industry, which is still around that 11% benchmark. So they've not only adopted gender sensitive policies like flexible work arrangements, but also daycare allowances, mentorship, professional development programs. So, you know, might compare that 22% to other banks in, say, Africa and think that's low, but for that market, you know, we really see that as a really strong impact for what they're doing and setting an example to the rest of the sector. I think it's also really important when companies have kind of systems in place already to regularly collect gender data, as Julia already mentioned. You know, this helps provide those baselines for improvement, highlights any issues in the business, and provides learning opportunities as well. I think that's something that companies can start thinking about, even at the SME level, around kind of how do you collect that data, and then helpful for investors to be able to kind of monitor that going forward. And maybe just say one more. I know I'm pretty tight on time, but I think there's also some sectors where, you know, it is always going to be challenging, for example, like infrastructure. And I think it's going back to where can realistic gains be made with kind of practical and positive actions. So we're actually going to be releasing a case study in the next few weeks on Kenhardt, which was a solar PV site in South Africa. And they actually had 500 female construction workers employed on that site. It was 13% of the workforce, but they also worked with a lot of kind of subcontractors who are women. So I think 48% or so of those SME subcontractors were female-led. And I think that's just a great example in terms of showing how it improved productivity, what the right reliability rates were, and hopefully it can kind of challenge some stereotypes in the market going forward.
Thank you so much, Kate, and we'll be really looking forward to seeing that case study. Gosh, so much to dive into, but in the interest of time, so I can see some great questions coming in. I want to just wrap up the panel discussion with the final question for you, Julia. Again, from Acumen's perspective, what do you look for when assessing a prospective investee? Does it differ at all across sector stages, etc.?
Yeah, thanks. And I saw the question around pipeline and diligence. So I'll frame my answer in 4 ways. So first, when we think about prospective investees, the markets and the kinds of companies that are typically early stage in solving the problems of poverty, based on the comments that we just heard, the context is really key. So we don't screen as Acumen based on gender performance to date. So we meet the world as it is, and we meet the companies where they are. But then what's important is to explore which improvements can be made. So we do ask across at our pipeline stage, or even when we source, we try to proactively source for more female entrepreneurs. And we also ask for the 2x data in our diligence process to get a sense of whether, first of all, whether the company actually has this data, which is the first data point. And then about the proportion. So we have a sense of how women are being considered in the business model, and also whether the product or service has an outside effect on women. So as part of that deal sourcing and deal making, we're including gender as part of that. And then also across when we do annual reporting, and we annually assess the 2x data, so we can have a track record there. And in fact, across our portfolio, we have 73% of compliance for Acumen, and we're aiming to continue that trajectory upwards. Then I think some of the common challenges we see and how SMEs can overcome it, I think it really starts with an ability to discuss gender, because gender is usually an emotive topic, especially if it's a male founder. If they haven't necessarily, sometimes they just pass on their HR person or their female colleague. Actually, how can gender be discussed is part of what we can see in the initial phase, either diligence or with our portfolio companies. And we recognize that data is usually not available, and sometimes policies and practices are not facilitating gender progress. So we can see some quick wins with just identifying, okay, well, can we have a conversation? What kind of data do we have, and what can be improved there? So then the next steps can then be identified based on that. So instead of trying to tackle gender as this big amorphous thing, you can think about what is the willingness to get support, and also where can we bring on gender expertise. So there's also a sense of how can we recognize gender norms but not hiding behind them, because in fact every organization, all of us also, will have gender dynamics as part of our working life. So we see some of these challenges, but the openness by which companies also can recognize where they have gaps gives us a positive signal that they're aware of it and willing to act. Then, so what stands out for us is when a company knows where they are and where they're going, and how business orientation can integrate gender to have that dual sense of progress. And the better clarity the company has on its own understanding of the gender data gaps and opportunities, the better we can then assess gender and the impact for us as an investor. And these are all positive elements, and they speak to the company's favor when they go through our investment processes. So being able to speak about gender, even if it's about being honest about where you're not yet, is already a starting point and a positive. And I think that includes the 2x data, sector segregated data as well, and especially if you've already progressed to having a gender action plan, like Kate mentioned. But also, if you don't have it, would you be willing to have that collaboration with the investor to try to move to that? And post investments, we really focus on inclusion grants, so where we can offer technical assistance and working with a gender specialist to help you on that journey as an SME. So how can the company then can integrate gender into their growth trajectory? So it's not a sort of siloed other priority, but it's really about how you can magnify your opportunities. And even if you haven't been on that journey for long, or if your context is not gender favorable, what can be done in your context to make progress is really key to us.
Yes, absolutely. And couldn't agree more with the starting with where you're at and with that contextual understanding of context. I think I really liked what you're saying, that you look for businesses that know where they are and know where they're going. And I think that's a nice link as well to the Inclusive Action Awards, where we're inviting enterprises to apply and tell us, like, where are you at and what have you been able to do to advance, given your starting point, given your context, and where are you trying to get to as well. And that brings me on to, I see a question in the chat around what works best to get businesses to go further for gender inclusion. And I'm just like, something that's on my mind a lot as we're, rolling out the Inclusive Action Awards and the Inclusive Action Hub, which aims to incentivize and inspire and equip enterprises to go further, is around the incentives, like what works and what innovative models have you experimented with that set those right incentives to go forward and go further for gender inclusion. So I'll open that to both of you, Kate and Julia. Are there any incentives that you'd like to speak about, or that you've seen, or that you're excited about?
Yeah, I'll have a go at trying to answer like 3 questions at once, because there's also an interesting one around improving workplace culture and to empower women to take on more leadership roles. I think generally what we're seeing is culture has to come from the top. So I think it's around having that visibility of seeing women in senior leadership positions, but also having that kind of culture instilled at the board level, at the senior leadership level, etc. And so we actually released an evidence report earlier last year as well. So that found strong evidence that investees with gender diverse ownership or leadership adopt gender smart business practices. Again, I'll put the link in the chat. And then it goes back to your point, how do you incentivize those leaders? So some of them might be doing that naturally. And so we work with, for example, I said before, the Boardroom Africa to get more women onto boards who want to champion, obviously, more women in the workplace and at senior levels. But also we can create financial incentives as well. So, for example, we've set up GIP Ghana, which is a platform in Ghana which provides long-term flexible funding to SMEs. And there's targets within the management's long-term reward structure around gender. So obviously the more gender that they're integrating into their own portfolio, the higher that reward and that incentive is. We've also adjusted kind of interest rates for some of our debt investees to boost female participation. For example, we did this through a loan to Sonatel, which is Senegal's largest telecom operator. So part of that pricing depends on number of women in management roles at Sonatel. So, it's kind of nudging companies to do the right thing if they need it, or it might be, as I said, kind of instilling that culture by making sure that they're having those people in senior management positions who can kind of take things forward. So hopefully I answered a few questions there. But Julia, also, you might have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, thanks. I think the question is interesting on the gender and the climate nexus. What we find is that, of course, we livelihoods cannot be taken separately from climate, and livelihoods and what our portfolio companies are doing needs to be including women as well as men. So what we try to do is really focus on the nexus, but integrating gender as part of our investment strategies as well as the business wins and orientation. Because if you separate gender, what happens is you're vulnerable to move into sort of an activist vibe that is not always the right dynamics that we as an investor hold. Our sphere of influence is not via sort of our levers are maybe different, and that's where we are trying to, what we really learned in the last 5 years is like, what can be our sphere of influence and what can be our sphere of control. We can only deliver as much incentives and facilitation and support as our portfolio companies are delivering the impact, and they're the ones driving their impact and business performance. I mean, I feel like investors are usually quite blasé about claiming all sorts of impact that the SMEs are delivering and our companies are delivering. So how can we also make sure that we approach this in a humble yet focused way? So I think for us, how that shows up is indeed considered how can we integrate gender in our offering, but also in this impact-linked finance way. So how can we make it interesting for the companies to consider, but also then how can we reward that? And that for that we have several mechanics similar to what you described. But actually, often we found that our companies are still pivoting their models. So it's really about collaborating with the company, and rather than coming at it with a data-heavy sort of directive orientation, what we found quite useful is working with our specialists that are localized on the ground and can work with the companies in particular. As soon as you're going to hit barriers with gender work, because it's just emotive and it's not transactional. So actually unlock the opportunities when you hit the barrier in conversation with a gender expert that can be like, but still have a business orientation. Because if you're just going to try to solve gender by itself, you're just going to get stuck in quite difficult conversations, and that tends to be blocking actually the integration ability to bring it into your strategy, which is gender and climate, but also into the company's actual business orientation and expertise, so that you don't end up sidelining it or becoming sort of getting a different swirl of conversations without an action orientation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think what you're touching on speaks to why we think about it as a journey, right? Like there's always going to be barriers, there's always going to be obstacles, and wherever your starting point, there's also always further to go on that journey. I see that we're almost at time. So I will just spend the last minute or so saying a huge thank you, a warm thank you to yourselves, Kate and Julia, for sharing your wealth of knowledge and experience, and to everyone who's joined as well for tuning in to explore why gender inclusion matters and how investors and SMEs can go further, faster. Before we do sign off, I'd love to just give a quick shout out again about the Inclusive Action Awards, which again celebrate SMEs leading the way on gender inclusion, and there's a $5,000 cash prize opportunity there. So if you're an SME operating in an emerging market, creating outcomes for women, strongly encourage you to apply. And you can find those resources in the chat as well. We'll follow up as well afterwards with an email with the recording, practical information about the Inclusive Action Awards and the resources that Kate and Julia have shared. And with that said, let me just once again say thank you to everyone and wish you a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Katie. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.